Most people think change is about becoming something new. What they don't talk about is what has to die first. There are versions of us that kept us alive for a season, but can't come with us any further. Letting them go isn't clean or heroic. It's quiet. It's violent in ways no one sees. This is about the moment you realize you can't go back, the ghost that tries to follow you forward, and the space you have to survive before anything new can take shape. This is when the old self dies. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Marcus Thornton Manifesto. I am Marcus Thornton, and today I will be doing a companion reading for my most recent essay, When the Old Self Dies, The Cost of Becoming Someone New. The Violence of Letting Go. The death of the old self is not gentle. You don't wake up one morning, decide to be different, and calmly walk into a better version of your life. That's a lie we tell because the truth is harder to swallow. Real change feels violent, not because it hurts your body, but because it dismantles the structures you've been leaning on to feel safe. Letting go cost you relationships that only made sense when you were in the mud. It cost you routines that numbed you but also made things make sense. It cost you identities that once gave you belonging. Mostly, it costs you the stories you've been telling yourself about why things are the way they are. It costs you certainty. The old self doesn't leave without a fight, but instead it starts doing death rolls. It knows that once you let go fully, there's no returning to the comfort of living an unexamined life. It tightens its grip, throws fear at you by making the future look vague and dangerous, and reminds you of everything you'll lose, yet stays conveniently quiet about everything you'll gain. This is the internal war nobody sees. On the outside, it looks like indecision, inconsistency, or like someone figuring things out. On the inside, it feels like being split in half. One part of you is pulling toward truth, discipline, and responsibility, while the other part is clawing toward familiarity, relief, and escape. Both feel equally urgent and convincing, and choosing one means killing the other. Growth requires death. You have to stop behaving as if the old version of you is still viable. You have to stop feeding it time, energy, justification, and access. You have to close familiar doors while parts of you are still standing in the doorway. There's real grief in this. You mourn the version of you that didn't know any better, the years spent surviving instead of living, and the belief that you could possibly have both comfort and truth without sacrifice. If you don't allow yourself to grieve that loss, you'll keep resurrecting the old self to avoid the pain of saying goodbye. This is where many people mistake pain for failure. They assume that if it hurts this much, something must be wrong. Pain is not a signal to stop, but a signal that something real is happening. You don't tear down load-bearing walls without feeling the strain. You don't dismantle an identity without shaking the foundation of your life. There's quiet violence in refusing to lie to yourself anymore, in saying no to the habits and narratives and coping mechanisms that once kept you afloat but are now dragging you under. There's chaos in choosing uncertainty with integrity over certainty without it. This phase strips you down and exposes how much of your life was built around avoidance. It reveals how often you chose relief over responsibility and the no longer abstract cost of staying the same. It's immediate, personal, and undeniable. There is no shortcut. You can numb it, delay it, and attempt to intellectualize it, but eventually, the choice becomes simple, though not easy. You either let the old self die all the way, or you spend the rest of your life negotiating with a ghost. The moment you realize you can't go back. There's a moment you realize, with a kind of calm exhaustion, that you can't go back to who you were because something in you finally sees the truth clearly enough to stop pretending. The old way doesn't work anymore. For me, that realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through repetition of cycles I knew all too well. The same promises, slips, and internal negotiations. The same mornings where I'd wake up knowing exactly how the day would feel before it even started. Lifeless in a way that's hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. There's a specific kind of fatigue that comes from living out of alignment. It's not physical tiredness, but more than that. I've heard others call it soul tired. The wariness of knowing you're capable of more, but continuing to choose less because it's familiar, easier, and it asks nothing of you. Over time, that gap between who you are and who you know you could be becomes unbearable. That's usually when the old self starts to die. You stop believing your own bullshit, and the stories you've been telling yourself for years suddenly feel and sound hollow. The lie doesn't land anymore. It just hangs there, exposed. Some call this a mental breakdown, depression, anxiety, a midlife crisis. Sometimes it is those things, but sometimes it's something far more honest. Clarity. You realize you've been surviving on the momentum of habits you inherited instead of chose, on identities you never consciously examined. You realize you've been living on misappropriated scripts, playing roles that once made sense but no longer fit. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. Awareness ruins denial. I once heard in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous that nothing will ruin your drinking like a head full of AA. The old self doesn't die because you hate it. It dies because you finally see it clearly. You see its patterns, avoidance, and coping mechanisms masquerading as personality. You see how much energy it takes to keep it alive, how much maintenance is required to stay the same, and how much effort goes into pretending you're fine. Somewhere in all that examination, the illusion breaks. You realize that going back would require lying to yourself again and would require numbing that clarity, stuffing it back down, distracting yourself until the edge dulls. You can distract yourself, sure, but you can't unknow what you know. This is the point where many people stall. They hover here for years, aware enough to be miserable, but not brave enough to change. They grieve the old self quietly while continuing to live as it publicly. It's a slow kind of death, stretched out over decades, but this moment doesn't ask you to act yet. It only asks you to be honest about the fact that something is over, that the old version of you got you this far, but it can't take you any further. Staying the same now comes with a higher cost than changing. This is where the old self begins to die, not because it failed, but because its work is done. Whether you like it or not, something else is waiting to be born. The ghost of who you were. The old self doesn't leave quietly. It lingers, watches, and waits for moments of weakness. It's patient because it knows you better than anyone. It knows your stress points, your fatigue thresholds, the exact emotional weather that makes you nostalgic for versions of life that nearly destroyed you. This is the part no one warned you about. Letting go isn't a clean break. It's haunting. The old self shows up as temptation, but not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it's not a bottle or a behavior. Sometimes it's a story, a memory, or a version of you that feels simpler, lighter, less demanding. It whispers things like, "You weren't that bad," or "You're taking this too seriously," or "You've earned a little relief." The dangerous thing is that parts of that voice are true. The old self kept you alive. It got you through things you didn't have the tools to face properly at the time. It improvised, coped, and adapted the only way it knew how. In some seasons, it was necessary. In some moments, it was heroic. It's easy to confuse gratitude with loyalty, but gratitude doesn't mean you let it keep driving. The ghost of who you were doesn't want to kill you. It wants to preserve itself. It wants continuity, familiarity, and predictability. It wants the comfort of old patterns, even if those patterns were slowly suffocating you. There's safety in repetition, even when repetition hurts. This is why relapse, regression, and self-sabotage often happen right after moments of clarity. Not because you're weak, but because the old identity is fighting for survival. When you stop feeding it, it panics. When you stop believing its stories, it escalates. It reminds you of who you used to be, what you used to tolerate, what you used to accept as normal. The mind edits the past and removes the pain, leaving only a highlight reel. It forgets the shame, the exhaustion, the quiet self-loathing, and presents the old life like it was manageable, even peaceful, as if you weren't slowly dying inside. That's the ghost's greatest trick. It doesn't say, "Come back and destroy your life." It says, "Come back and rest." Rest without integrity is just another form of decay. This is where many people get stuck in a feedback loop. They move forward just enough to feel exposed, then retreat just enough to feel safe. Forward, back, progress, relapse, growth, regression, and each cycle deepens the confusion because it feels like failure instead of resistance. What's really happening is simpler. The old self is trying to negotiate terms. It's asking if it can stay relevant, tag along, or if it can be repackaged, rebranded, softened enough to coexist with the new direction. Sometimes you let it. You compromise and tell yourself you'll just keep a piece of it, just the harmless parts, just the edge, or just the comfort. That's rarely how it works. Identities don't merge cleanly. One eventually dominates, and the old self has years of practice. Letting it go isn't about hatred or shame, but about recognition that survival strategies don't automatically become life strategies. The past version of you cannot be the architect of your future. The ghost will keep visiting. It will test you when you're tired, lonely, stressed, or unsure, and you show up when progress feels slow and the new identity still feels unfamiliar. Its presence doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're changing, and change always disturbs the dead. The question isn't whether the old self will try to come back. It's whether you'll let it convince you that comfort is the same thing as truth. The space between who you were and who you're becoming. After the old self starts to loosen its grip, there's a stretch of time that feels deeply wrong. You're not who you used to be anymore, but you're also not yet anyone new. The habits that once defined you are gone or fading. The routines that kept you oriented don't hold the same weight, and the identity you relied on no longer fits, but nothing has replaced it yet. You wake up and move through your days with a strange sense of dislocation, like you're living in a body that hasn't been fully assigned a role. It's uncomfortable because there's no narrative to hide behind and no familiar patterns to retreat into. You're just there, stripped of certainty, carrying awareness without structure. Awareness without structure feels like standing on open ground with no shelter, and this is where most people panic. They mistake this emptiness for regression and assume something has gone wrong because life feels quieter, slower, less defined. The ego hates this stage because it thrives on identity, momentum, and recognition. In this space, there's none of that. Just stillness, ambiguity, and the persistent feeling that you're untethered. This isn't a void. It's a clearing. This is where the real work happens, even though it doesn't look like work at all. This is where you learn how much of your sense of self was borrowed from behavior instead of values, and where you discover whether you can sit with yourself without performing. The temptation here is to rush to grab onto something, anything, that gives you shape again. A new identity, a new obsession, or a new label. People leave one version of themselves only to sprint into another, unchanged at the core, just dressed differently. Same avoidance, new aesthetic. If you move too fast through this space, you miss what it's trying to teach you. This phase demands patience, not passive waiting, but disciplined presence. You must cultivate the ability to stay without feeling the silence, resisting the urge to explain yourself, and to let the discomfort exist without turning it into a problem that needs solving. What's happening here isn't confusion, it's recalibration. Your nervous system is learning a new baseline. Your mind is learning how to exist without the constant stimulus of old patterns. Your sense of self is reorganizing around something deeper than habit or reaction. This makes time, and it feels lonely, even if your life hasn't changed much on the surface. There's grief here too. Grief for the clarity that came with certainty, even when that certainty was false, and for the identity that gave you a place in the world, even if that place was slowly suffocating you. If you can stay here, if you can resist the urge to flee this middle ground, something important begins to form. A sense of self that isn't dependent on motion or validation or performance, but one that can respond rather than react. This is the space most people abandon because it offers no applause, but it's also the space where you stop living on momentum and start living with intention. Nothing flashy is happening here. No breakthrough, no transformation montage. Just the slow, quiet construction of a foundation strong enough to carry what comes next. If you can endure this space without lying to yourself, without rushing to escape it, you don't just become different. You become real. Becoming the person you needed. The new self arrives only partially formed, with no ceremony, no announcement, and no moment where you suddenly feel complete or certain. You start making different decisions without having to argue with yourself about them, and you stop negotiating with the same old excuses. You notice that some things no longer tempt you, not because you're stronger in some dramatic way, but because they no longer make sense. The new self begins not as a personality, but as a posture. You stop asking who you're supposed to be and start asking what needs to be done. You stop performing growth and start living it. You stop trying to outrun your past and start integrating it. The person you're becoming isn't built in reaction to who you were. It's built with intention, clarity, and responsibility. Reaction creates movement, but intention creates direction. At some point, you realize you're no longer trying to prove anything. You're not chasing validation. You're not trying to redeem your past through effort or suffering. And you're not attempting to impress anyone with how far you've come. You're just showing up consistently, honestly, and without the need for an audience. That's usually when people around you start to notice a change, not because you're louder or more confident, but because you're steadier. You don't swing as wildly, explain yourself as much, or collapse under pressure the way you used to. There's a weight to you now. You're not perfect, but you're reliable, and reliability is rare. This is often when people realize you're becoming the version of themselves they once needed. The person who doesn't disappear when things get hard, who doesn't lie to themselves to stay comfortable, and who can sit in discomfort without panicking. The person who chooses long-term integrity over short-term relief. This isn't about becoming exceptional, but about becoming aligned. Your values start dictating your behavior rather than your emotions. Your discipline becomes quieter, less performative. Your life becomes simpler, not because you've lost ambition, but because you've gained clarity. You know what matters now, and you don't waste as much energy pretending otherwise. There is still struggle here, still doubt, and still moments where the old self whispers, but those moments don't derail you anymore. They pass through instead of taking control, and you acknowledge them without obeying them. Perhaps that's the real transformation, not becoming someone extraordinary, but becoming someone solid, someone you can trust, and someone who can carry responsibility without resentment and freedom without self-destruction. When the old self dies, it doesn't make room for perfection. It makes room for integrity, and integrity, lived over time, quietly builds a life that doesn't need to be escaped. The funeral no one attends. No one gathers to mark the death of your old self. There's no acknowledgement, no applause, no validation that what you've let go of mattered. The world doesn't stop to notice that you buried a version of yourself that once felt essential. This is a private ritual, and in many ways, that's the point. The most important deaths in a person's life happen without witnesses. The old self doesn't get a eulogy unless you personally write it, which many mental health professionals recommend. It doesn't get honored publicly, doesn't get remembered fondly by others, but it simply fades from relevance as you stop feeding it. Old habits lose their pull. Excuses lose their authority. The inner voice gets quieter, not because it's silenced, but because it's no longer believed, and that can feel strange. There's a temptation to memorialize, romanticize the struggle, to keep dragging pieces forward out of nostalgia or guilt or fear of forgetting where you came from. Remembering isn't the same as resurrecting. You don't honor the old self by living as you once did, but by letting its suffering mean something. The moment you accept that the bridge behind you is burned, not out of punishment, but out of necessity, is where freedom begins. Not the loud, intoxicating kind, but the kind that comes from no longer being divided against yourself, from knowing that even when life gets hard, you won't betray yourself to make it easier. The old self had its season. It carried you when you didn't know how to carry yourself, absorbed damage you weren't equipped to process, and made choices you wouldn't make now, but that doesn't make them meaningless. They were survival, adaptation, and a part of the path. When the old self dies, something else becomes possible. Not certainty or comfort, but coherence. A life where your actions align with your values and your discipline isn't fueled by fear. Your stillness doesn't feel like collapse, and you don't need to escape because there's nothing you're running from. You don't become someone else, but instead you become yourself without all the noise. Once you've crossed that line, once you've buried what needed burying, there's no going back. Not because you're trapped, but because you're finally facing forward without needing to lie about where you've been. The old self doesn't need to be remembered. It simply needs to be acknowledged and then released. So, that was a reading of the newest essay, When the Old Self Dies. If you've stuck around this long, really appreciate your support, and I hope you got something out of this essay. I got so much out of writing it. It gave me the opportunity to actually process the process, to risk being redundant there, of growing through all of the things that I've had to grow through. There will always be moments of self-doubt when we're on the path of becoming something new, especially when we're doing things that scare us. Changing patterns, changing behaviors, shying away from the things that brought comfort. These are all scary things, but it's in that fear. Once we figure out how to harness it and use the energy that it provides, it's in that fear that growth happens. There's a pretty famous book out there. It became a movie. Some of you may have heard of it, called Eat, Pray, Love. Yes, that's right. I'm about to quote Eat, Pray, Love. And Liz Gilbert, the author, I'm not sure if she wrote this line, but Julia Roberts says it in the movie. She says, "Ruin is the road to transformation." That is the most true statement I believe I've ever heard. In order to change, we have to destroy. We destroy the things that keep us complacent, that hold us back, and that keep us small when the world is already trying to do that. I know in my own life, I've kept myself comfortable for the sake of simply not looking stupid, quote unquote, or being seen doing something that I might fail at. So I've also heard someone say, it's not failure that you fear, but it's being seen failing. That's also extremely true in my own life. And when I Stop doing things for the sake of reputation, which, granted, reputation is important, especially in our professional lives, our personal lives. It builds a type of currency that we can use with others, especially if we're trying to influence or lead or mentor, or even if we're just trying to help out our friends. That currency of reputation is important, but it's not everything, especially when it comes at the expense of chasing meaning and purpose in our own lives and doing things that we feel deep down inside we need to be doing. So, change is hard, but it's not impossible. If you've gotten any sort of value out of this, please share it. It's going to be up on Spotify. It's on my Substack. If you go to the Substack, feel free to sign up, subscribe to the Marcus Thornton Manifesto Substack. In Spotify, you can find it in the description. There will be a link to my Substack along with some show notes. And there will be more to come. I'm only getting started. So thank you very much for listening, and Godspeed.